Welcome. My name is Stephen Foster. I'm the I'm the new Dean of Arts, Faculty of Arts here at OCAD. Brand new. I've only been here just a few days, in fact. So, but thank you for coming. Before we start, I'm going to just make an acknowledgement here. OCAD University acknowledges the ancestral and traditional territories of the Mississauga of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat, who are the original owners and custodians of the land on which we stand. I'd also like to recognize our Métis cousins that may be in the audience, and also our Indigenous urban community, who happens to be one of the largest in the country, I believe. So, thank you. On behalf of the President Sarah Diamond and the Faculty of Art, I want to welcome you to OCAD University tonight. The event is part of an ongoing partnership between OCAD University and the power plant. The partnership seeks to activate and sustain, promote dialogue and discourse on contemporary art, to bring leading contemporary artists to the OCAD U community and general public, and promote awareness of the power plant's cultural programming, to foster cross-institutional dialogue and collaboration between the power plant and OCAD U. The partnership between OCAD U and the power plant was initiated following the talk by British artist Michael Landry in 2017 and formalized soon after with the international lecture series talk by renowned curator Ralph Rugoff in May 2018. Other artists featured in these talks include Carla Black, Alicia Henry, in conversation with curator Diana, I'm going to say Agudis. Agatis, sorry. Thank you. And most recently, Naeem Mohimi, in conversation with artist Jarrett Verdera. I'd like to thank Gitan Vernon, Josh Hellman, Laura Demers, and Haley Jones at the power plant, OCAD U's marketing and communication team, Sarah Curie, Adam Wendels, and Natalie Pavlenko. And that's, I think, all. And I'd like to also introduce Josh Human, the curator in education public programs at the power plant gallery. Awesome. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much. Well, thank you so much, Stephen, and welcome to OCAD University. We look forward to working with you as well as our previous contacts here at OCAD U. So I'm Josh Human. I'm the curator of education and public programs at the power plant, and I am incredibly pleased to welcome all of you to tonight's program. Of course, to extend enormous thanks to Dr. Sarah Diamond, to Stephen Foster. Special thanks to Dr. Glenn Lowry, Executive Director of Partnership and Advisor to the Provost, and John Rubino, Assistant Outreach and International Projects, who have been instrumental in helping to coordinate tonight's program. This program is part of our build-up at the power plant to the opening on Friday evening of our winter 2020 season. Logically, because artists, and in this case, guest curator, are in town, we organize programs leading up to that opening. But we hope to see all of you Friday evening from 8 to 11 p.m., our opening. And then, of course, those exhibitions will continue into May of 2020. For information about our other programs, which include a free conversation between artist Nafuzu Ramirez Figueroa and the power plant's curator of exhibitions, Lauren Barnes, on this coming Saturday at 1 p.m. We have free Sunday scenes. We'll have a free symposium related to the Dawit L. Petros exhibition, as well as a free film series related to this exhibition. So please visit our website, thepowerplant.org. If you visit the power plant, please grab one of our program guides. But really, to focus on this evening's program, I'm pleased to introduce our two speakers. Dawit L. Petros is an assistant professor in the Department of Photography at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. He received his MFA in visual art from the School of the Museum of Fine Arts, Tufts University, a BFA in photography from Concordia University, a BFA in history from the University of Saskatchewan, and completed the Whitney Independent Study Program in New York. His recent exhibitions include the 13th Havana Biennial, the Herbert F. Johnson Museum of Art, Cornell University, both 2019, Dakar Biennial in Senegal in 2018, Prospect 4 in New Orleans in 2017, and Bamako Encounters Biennale in 2017. Turning to our other speaker tonight, Irene Campolmi is an independent curator based in Copenhagen who works in transit as she curates exhibition projects around the world. Recent projects were at MAT, the Museum of Art, Architecture, and Technology in Lisbon, the Kunsthal Charlottenburg in Copenhagen, a collaboration on the Estonian Pavilion at the 58th Venice Biennale, and 68 Art Institute in Copenhagen. Before going independent, Campolmi was at the Max Planck Institute, Kunsthistorische Institute in Florence, the Italian Embassy in Copenhagen, and the National Gallery of Modern Art in Rome. She's working to complete her PhD thesis on the Art Museum of the 21st Century, on curatorial ethics, sustainability, and research in contemporary curating, which I hope to read someday, not in the not too distant future. But for right now, I will hand everything over to Dawit and Irene. Please join me in welcoming them.
Quando sono andato in Italia c'è un altro fattore, che si sono totalmente dimenticati dell'Eritrea, totalmente. Avevo la nostalgia, pensavo all'Eritrea, ma avevano perso l'ispirazione e avevano totalmente abbandonato l'idea dell'Eritrea, totalmente.
When they went back to Italy, they totally forgot us. They were nostalgic and thought of Eritrea. But they lost hope and completely abandoned the idea of Eritrea. Completely.
An introduction by way of a story.
At a cafe in Khartoum, Sudan, 2016, a young Eritrean migrant named Medhane Berhe is arrested by Italian, Sudanese, and British authorities. He is wrongly accused of being the notorious people smuggler Medhane Mered, despite the wealth of evidence to the contrary. This is a picture released by Italian police in June 2016. Berhe remains in prison in Palermo for 4 years, while his case slowly moved through the Italian legal system. He is set free in 2019.
Every photograph has a history, a language with which it's constructed. What is the language of this image?
There are several key features in this image: the blurred handcuffs, the armed carabinieri, the presence of authority established, and the power restored. The documented event, an image of an arrest, depicts Medhani Bere as the African other, the criminal, a silent icon of an image or in an image over which he has no authority. The other as an object for scrutinizing gaze of power.
The strength of representation persists. An absence of real knowledge persists.
This is an image of non-recognition.
This is an image of non-recognition.
Or this is an image of non-recognition.
This, too, is an image of non-recognition. What histories are activated by the presence of young Eritreans coming into Italy?
Perhaps that Italian forgot, or rather misplaced, their colonial histories to Eritrea, East Africa. And the scale of the transnational migration of Italians to numerous continents, is this perhaps?
So what type of understanding would an integrated reading of these events enable?
The unexamined effects of colonialism and population transfer cannot be confined to a distant place and time.
A numerical digression.
In the century of Italy's mass migration, how many Italians migrated to other spaces?
Between 1876 and 1976, approximately 27 million Italians left Italy and immigrated to multiple continents. This number apparently rises to 30 million if we include our present decade. Italy's diaspora has produced a population estimated at 60 million descendants around the world.
The number of residents in Italy in 2014 was 60 million. In 2013, 4,636,000 Italian citizens were registered in the list of Italians abroad, the IRE. And these are people who have moved to a new country and retained Italian citizenship or acquired dual citizenship. I'm one of those.
There are roughly 4,922,085 immigrants in Italy. These are individuals whose countries of origins, including countries like Eritrea and other former colonies. What can we extract from these numerical coincidences, or are they just mere anecdote?
The numbers of Italians living abroad is practically the same as the numbers of foreigners living in Italy.
So then what about the myth of invasion? Can space be represented by the absence of previous or potential residents?
Italy's diaspora cannot be analyzed as a series of fragmented events, but must be studied as a continuum that includes both intranational and international migrations, transoceanic and transmediterranean. Gli italiani avevano fatto molto, però c'era quel rancore che erano dei segregatori, colonizzatori, fascisti. Si diceva un po' di tutto degli italiani e gli italiani l'hanno presa male, molto male.
Italians have done so much for us, but people said they were fascists, segregators, colonizers. A lot was said about the Italians, and they took it badly, very badly.
Ecco perché, quando sono andati via, hanno totalmente dimenticato il nostro popolo. E questo rancore c'è ancora. Comunque, gli italiani vivevano in gran lusso. Avevano la loro villa, la loro macchina, la loro piccola industria, i loro cinema per gli svaghi, avevano Passaua per il fine settimana, vivevano da grandi pascià. Gli italiani stavano bene in Eritrea, veramente. Avevano messo su fabbriche alimentari, panifici, pastifici, avevano concessionari per le auto e aziende agricole. Producevano ortaggi, vegetali, legumi, aranceti, frutteti, in tutto il basso piano.
That's why when they left, they totally forgot our people. And this rancor is still there. Nonetheless, Italians, they were living in great luxury. They had their villas, their cars, their small industries, their cinema for entertainment. They had Massawa for the weekend. They lived like big pasha. Italians were fine here, really. They'd set up food factories, bakeries, pasta factories, had car dealers and farms that produced vegetables, legumes, orange groves, and orchards all throughout the lowlands. Interestingly, the majority of the Italians who moved to Eritrea in the first 2 decades of the 20th century were originally from southern Italy. The irony then of southern Italy now being situated as the gateway to Fortress Europe.
Un estratto dalla rivista coloniale, il brano Immigrazione, colonizzazione e emigrazione, 1933.
An extract from Rivista Coloniale, text Immigration, Emigration, Colonization, 1933. The only remedy for the overabundance of the European population and the consequent unemployment is emigration to the colonies.
L'Africa è destinata a subire nei prossimi anni la penetrazione definitiva delle razze più numerose e meglio preparate. Non soltanto le nostre colonie potranno contribuire alla soluzione del problema demografico in Italia, ma pensiamo anche che in quelle degli altri la nostra popolazione, attraverso imprese commerciali e aziende agricole, potrà trovare condizioni convenienti alla propria attività.
Africa is destined to undergo the definitive penetration of the most numerous and best prepared breeds in the coming years. Not only will our colonies be able to contribute to the solution of the demographic problem, we think that also in those of others, our population, through commercial enterprises, our farms, will be able to find suitable conditions for activity.
La nostra è una di quelle razze che per decenni è rimasta sacrificata e oggi ha trovato il tempo propizio per utilizzare un'energia che ad altri manca e conquistare delle solide posizioni per il futuro. Noi realizzeremo un piano che, mentre assicurerà all'Italia salde basi economiche in Africa, assorbirà l'eccedenza della popolazione.
Ours is one of those breeds that for decades remained sacrificed and today has found the right time to use an energy that others lack and conquer solid positions for the future. We will implement a plan that, while ensuring Italy's strong economic base in Africa, will absorb the surplus of the population.
what we have just read through is an extract of the research that Dawit has conducted for the project Spazio Disponibile, and that we have discussed throughout the past year, basically. And we sort of like broke this fiction to enter back in what we could say is the conversation that we would like to create on the research that you have done. What you see here in the back is an image of Dawit's previous body of works called The Stranger Notebooks. And this project is inscribed in a deeper and broader investigation of Italy's recent inbound arrivals of immigrants due to economic or political pressure. So I was wondering how you stepped from this project into what we are going to also introduce inside like the project Spazio Disponibile, which is the Italian translation for available space.
In 2014, I engaged in a 14-month road trip through West Africa, North Africa. Can you hear me? And when I was moving through the continent, the primary question that I was looking at was really thinking about narratives of intra-African migration that very few people talk about, that the majority of the people on the continent are moving within one African state to another. So this notion of the African diaspora within the African continent became central to this absence that I was interested in looking at. Once I traveled across the Mediterranean and began to think about the implications of what it means for that body of water to be transformed into this impenetrable sort of space in which traffic can move one way with enormous ease, but not the other. I arrived into Italy and I began to look for the material presence of a particular writer from Abyssinia, from my part of the world, who had spent 5 years in Italy. And again, there was this incredible absence. I couldn't find any physical material. And so the Stranger's Notebook and the research that led to Spazio Disponibile was really driven by this idea of what are these historical gaps? How are they constructed? How are they perpetuated? How do they operate? And as an artist, what and how can you work with, these gaps?
That's very interesting, because perhaps we can go through the previous images. But what you have done within this new body of research was exactly to enter in a gap, in an historical gap. Italy is a country that has colonized East Africa, but that somehow has lost or forgot, misplaced this history, and this becomes evident somehow when it forgets that it colonizes territories that then claim back now to go to somehow like reach the borders of Italy. And there is another aspect besides that I think it's interesting in your project. Can we go to this other one? No, this one. Which is that in this research, you have brought you have brought basically to the surface what has been the colonial project, which has been also a project that has brought modernity in Eritrea. So for an Eritrean, modernity has come as a direct link of colonization. And somehow this is very embedded in the body of works that you have produced, because this modernity has also been created and built by the Eritreans. So in your body of work, I was really struck by the way in which you emphasize the ambiguity of the colonial project, the migration project, and at the same time the modernity project. Can you talk about that?
That's a lot.
I know.
I think I would like to try and break that down into portions. On the one hand, this idea of modernity and the construction of the modern Eritrean nation state is an incredibly complicated one that can't happen without the colonial project. It's a part of what part of what was compelling for me in this research was to really think about, we grew up always hearing Talyan Eritrea Sarihama, this idea that the Italians built Eritrea. And it was images like this that sort of give lie to that, to this notion that the colonized subject were simply passive recipients on whom the development of the country towards its formulation as a nation it becomes. And so it's part of this research is really attempting to unlearn some of what I've learned within the context of the familial thing. The other part of it is also sorry, there was a second point that you'd made. I'm sorry, I've lost my.
How modernity was connected to the transnational sort of migration of Italians.
Yes,
right?
yes. Sorry, thank you for bringing me back. Thank you for bringing me back. So it's the being in Italy, and and particularly being in southern Italy. So the majority of my time was in Catania, being with young Eritreans who had endured that difficult trip across the Mediterranean. And existed in this space in which their presence or their historical connection to Italy was simply not recognized, that was something that I found quite jarring. And then you traverse through Rome, and there are all of these reminders everywhere. There's Pizza Eritrea, Asmara Library, and I think and I'm so glad that you use this notion of historical memories which are displaced, rather than sort of disappearing in a place that they're not accessible, so that it's an active process of not remembering, because the reminders are there. And so those are two key ideas that I brought into this project, is how does the Eritrean nation get built? How do these questions of the construction of the country unfold? And Whereas in the first project, The Stranger's Notebook, I was really interested in telling the story through bodies on the move. In this instance, I was much more interested in doing research that focused on infrastructure, architecture, etc. So that is sort of a cursory overview of how I got here.
I guess architecture, but also like objects, because what gives the title to the exhibition and also to the new body of work, Spazio Disponibile, available space, is an extract from what is called a Rivista Coloniale, or colonial magazine, which was a tool, a magazine that was like spread as an official governmental how would you say, like a document throughout the different colonies, but also to the colonies or group of migrants abroad. For example, in South and North America, in Germany and other places where Italian had migrated since basically the end of the 19th century. So to say 1882 is sort of like the kind of beginning of the migration.
But the magazine itself runs from 1906 until 1943. And so I keyed in on this publication because the transformation of Italian the transformation of Italian colonial sort of policy is visible in how this magazine itself evolves visually and also in terms of the content. But also, a lot of the threads of continuity are there, right?
And one of the reasons why we sort of thought about the exhibition being titled Spazio Disponibile, you can see here one of the image that is sort of like part of a previous body of work called the Stranger Notebook, was because there was an ambiguity in the term. One that referred to Africa or Eritrea as an available space to be colonized and occupied, but the other one as the sort of like space that the exhibition, or the post-colonial space that the exhibition would rise for a new discourse and a new research to sort of come up and be visualized. Maybe my question would be how have you structured the research for this project?
The challenge was was limiting an incredible amount of material and really thinking about, so on the one hand I had a lot of archival photographs, the type of which you've seen. There was a lot of audio recordings that I made throughout Asmara when I was there over the course of the summer. There was sort of this filmic work of this architectural space in Montreal. So the challenge was trying to locate a story that is legible across seemingly diverse and disconnected histories. And I think the third element that we haven't talked about is in 2013, 14, 15, 16, you may remember that there were a lot of, and mostly post-16, once Trump is elected, a lot of immigrants from the US start crossing across the border into the United States. Cross the border from the United States into Canada. A lot of them were young Eritreans, and many of them were young Eritreans that I met and worked with in Catania, Italy. And so they had spent a significant portion of time in Italy, couldn't evolve outside of an incredibly sort of stagnant position, and so many of them took this other circuitous route of going by plane to Ecuador, from Ecuador through a host of countries in Central America, Mexico, get arrested in an American detention camp, and then you make your way through the United States and walk across the Canadian border. So at that point became the other part of this research and this project was a way for me to think about what kinds of colonial histories is that also beginning to evoke, and specifically in relationship to the very celebratory sort of narratives around the Italian migration to Canada. And so part of what I was interested in is if you have these individuals who are making Eritrea, Italy, South America into Canada, these geographies are now linked, both in terms of the contemporary and in terms of the history. And so I was determined to find a way in which I could do the type of historical research and find forms that could connect these in a meaningful way without it becoming so expensive that there are no connective threads.
And how did you do?
How I did that was I used this building in Montreal to talk about the presence of Italian migration into Canada. And it's a building called Casa d'Italia in Montreal, built in 1936. And as I began to do research into the construction of this building, and it is being built at the same time as this other incredible, engineering feat in Eritrea. At that time, the world's longest teleferica in Asmara. So these two projects for me linked the historical that was being connected in the present. And so I made a film, and I made this large multi-panel work that has these elements at the core.
Maybe to come back to sort of like what brought you also to the research of the Casa d'Italia, which is the Italian house. It's one I think like crucial factor that at the same time that Italians were migrating to the colonies, as we were reading before, because of need of being employed, the same need of being employed brought Italians and other migrants to migrate in North America, and in this case in Canada. But Italy was a very young country. It was basically created in 1861 and then kind of confirmed with an addition of the Vatican in 1871. And it was not a country, by the way. Like, it was an agglomeration of different territories that had been governed by with different structures, and they had different languages. They had no means of being a nation or a country per se. What Teresa Fiore, an historian, says is that the only way why Italy was considered a nation was because of its like natural borders. The natural, the coast defined the territory by itself. But when they started to migrate, because there was no employment, and especially the south of Italy was a territory that was like living in misery in many ways after the Bourbons. This migration movement happened at the same time in Eritrea, in East Africa, and then in Canada. So I think that this sort of like triangulation that from Italy brings Italians to Eritrea, and some from Eritrea to North America, and from Italy to North America, so in Canada, creates this kind of like interesting triangulation, which obviously can be expanded, but which sort of became the focus also of your research.
The exhibition, which I hope you have an opportunity to see, is really anchored around this triangulation. Work that attempts to raise this question from these three perspectives in such a way that all three locations are very, very present, but that they're present from an analysis that is driven by an Eritrean, a subject of the colony, looking at that history, right?
I think it's very interesting also, by the way, when you see this image of the Casa d'Italia, if you will have the opportunity to see the exhibition, which we really hope so, the voice describes a building, and the building seems sort of the voice described the building as we see in this image, but the same architectural elements that characterize this building are the elements that recurs in Asmara in the greatest majority of the building.
Don't give it all away.
Oops, that's the thing. But that's also what was sort of like, for me, became like one of the most interesting sort of like topics of conversation with you, because we see that these elements were sort of representing Italianness in the first 3 decades of the 20th century. And the sort of like architectural elements became a connector to create an identity also, and a cultural identity that would sort of unify migrants abroad. Italian migrant abroad.
I think for me, a very simple way of thinking about it is, it's this approach to an integrated looking at these histories that brings them together. So rather than keeping an image, rather than keeping a particular history, rather than attempting to keep a history outside of, fixed within a vacuum, sort of really looking at it in a much wider context, and establishing a more complicated and a more nuanced set of understandings or set of questions. And that's the perfect segue to say, let's have some questions, or let's have a conversation, I think. complexity of this building really addresses this question? Those questions are encoded in what happens in this building. So 1936, while so in Montreal, so yeah, so a lot of Italian labor builds not just the nation state, but also builds the city of Montreal, right? So it's, but there's also the inverse of that, so that it's not just the modern nation state of Canada that is being built, but simultaneously the modern nation state of Italy is being constructed by virtue of the fact that a lot of the Italians, there's a high rate of return to Italy over the course of that long sort of, when we were in that numeric, when we were looking at all of these numbers. So I think that's one thing that is super important. Secondly, another reason it was important to work in this site is the fact that there's this moment in 1941 when the visual iconography of this building is so startling to the Canadian government, and the events that are happening in there, which is Italian education and Italian community center, whose role and function partially is funded by the Italian government, which at that moment obviously means that it would have a fascist leaning. But at that moment, the moment that the Italian is the other, and the building is taken away from the Italians and made a military depot by the Canadian government. So again, it is intersected with these complex sort of questions of the nation state, right? So it's as an artist, you come across particular things that everything that you need to propose is right there, you know? And so, and then the third thing is the analysis of this building happens from, so the voice that you heard right at the beginning, and part of the voice that we were translating and working with is Geometra, who's a surveyor that works for the Eritrean government and is part of the Asmara Heritage Project. So again, this notion of the construction of the modern state, that question is still very, very present within the context of Eritrea. And so his analysis of that building brings up those questions as pertinent in Eritrea today. Does that, you know? As I began to commit to this form of research, I think it was always important for me to not fall, it's like old black and white images are really seductive, right? And the notion of digging in the archive and finding those, all of that is really, really seductive. But central to this exhibition is sound and voices and the body as an archival source. And so there's a lot of material and research that goes into different registers of sound, conversation, musical, labor, the emptiness of buildings, right? And then working with that as an archival sort of set of materials, and a lot of which is given to you in such a way that it's material and research that one feels through their body rather than necessarily sees through their eyes, for example. So I say this as a way of articulating how part of my cultural heritage is one that is really rooted in orality, and sort of thinking about complementing and supplementing the filmic work, the object work, with the oral. And this is something that I think has been developing and progressing, specifically since I'd say the Stranger's Notebook, but a little bit before.
And if I may add something, when we initially met, Dawit had an enormous quantity of scanned books, and especially scanned pieces and documents from those colonial magazines, all written in Italian. And so to sort of like connect to your question of the archival material, what we wanted to sort of like have in the performative lecture, or at least like this sort of like performance, was that exactly we both sort of embody or have inherited a cultural heritage from which we have sort of like escaped as migrant or as mobile people or people living in transit. That's what I like to call in the bio that I give to people that introduce me. But that in a way, by the time in which we connected, and I saw that we like archive of documents, is where I saw, okay, this is where we could, dig in. This is where we can find material to tell the story or tell different stories that have not really come up to the surface, or that are perhaps like visualized by photographs, but that is sort of like complex or ambiguous or difficult to sort of place within an historical chronology, or like, because when we talk about like Italian colonization in a sense of Eritrea, then there is not like direct image of this labor of Eritreans constructing this, and in a sense constructing also their own city, Asmara. So yeah, it's a lot of body of work.
Yes. Answers, no. I mean, I'm trying to clarify what the questions are for me. But it's interesting that you mentioned Fanon. And this is in no way to be dismissive of Fanon at all. But part of what happens as as someone who comes from a colonial relationship that hasn't been studied and hasn't been known as well, is there's often an attempt to locate it or to analyze it through the discourse of the French colonial experience or the Anglophone colonial experience. And it's not to say that those theoretical or those tools of ideas are not relevant. So Fanon is absolutely relevant in as much as part of what I find so complicated about one of the protagonists in the piece is that he almost sounds like a fascist at these moments. Right? There are moments when the voice that he articulates is indistinguishable. But the mechanisms which make that operative in that context isn't just for me, okay, so here's somebody who's this isn't just an internal colonization. The dynamics of colonization in Eritrea are very different than they were in other parts of Africa. So all of which to say that part of, so it's not the answers I'm trying to figure out, I'm trying to understand what the questions, I'm trying to formulate the questions around how these, how these histories can be, and how these specific histories can be unpacked. Because part of what happens for me when I'm in Italy is there's something incredibly familiar, right? That there's unpacking that requires my understanding something that I'm trying to figure out. Does that make sense? You know? So I don't think we disagree. So I think, yes, absolutely that there are points of relevance, but I think something that is super, super important, the point that I'm trying to make is that it is also important to look at the specific historical dimensions of one particular place and attempt to understand it and know it within that framework, right? Because the Anglophone, I described earlier this 14-month road trip through 5 months in many African nations in which I was flatly sort of told either I was not an African, which was just completely impossible for me to understand, or a complete sort of rejection of parts of the Horn of Africa as not being situated within certain parts of Africa. So then I can't simply exchange a theoretical framework that comes out of experiences that are rooted in one place when I'm trying to understand another. Does that make sense? Yeah. 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 I hope I answered.
Yeah.
I have a question for you, Irene.
Yes.
So, how is Italy dealing with its colonial past? So, of course, hearing from Dawit about what's going on, sort of in an Eritrean mindset, but what are Italians saying about their colonial past? How are they grappling with that?
Well, I don't feel I can answer for this big cluster of people that are called Italians. But definitely a first evidence is that this history is not taught at in schools. So it means that there is a set of governmental bodies, especially like the Institute of Africa Orientale, that are now not open. They have been closed for financial reasons, but all this history is somehow buried there. So it's complicated. It's very complicated because you have this idea of the Italian migrant per necessity, and usually you have the idea of migration towards North America. So there is always a Zio di Brooklyn, right? In New York or something, or in North America, but it's really always, it's difficult to see or to imagine a migration to Eritrea or to East Africa. Whereas when we go to this archival image, we see that there is a little Rome. And this definition of Little Rome is something that we have heard also within the oral testimonies that Dawit and I have gone through. And so this is sort of like, the question comes, why don't we know this? Like, are we as a nation ashamed of this? And if so, why? And perhaps like a direct link is that obviously there is a factor in relation to forgetting that we were a colonial country and that we were colonizing available spaces, Spazio Disponibile. But at the same time, there is another connection that Italy lost these colonies. and it was defeated like repeatedly. And so there is a double factor of being ashamed of this. So I guess that this, like, it's again like an ambiguous discourse that goes in relation to this like misplacement, because nobody can forget this. You know, there are historical documentation, but it's easy when you put something aside. It's like sort of a trauma, right? Traumas are events that have sort of like blocked your memory. They become a blank spot, and all of a sudden they reappear into some other forms. And if you let me say so, they appear when we receive through Lampedusa and to the Italian shores of like Catania and Sicily. We receive like migrants that escape for the same condition, and we sort of forget that we were welcome, but we are not welcoming these forms of migration. I hope I answered. Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Josh, I think the only thing that I would add is part, the reason I'm so grateful for, I'm grateful for this collaboration that Gaetan has put together, because, and I said to Irene, I've said from the beginning, you're not here to speak for Italians, nor am I here to speak for Eritreans, but that we can have an informed conversation that can, that can really address for one another our own blind spots. So on a personal, even just that on a personal level, and then that informs everything else that goes into the decisions that we make going into the work.
And maybe just to explain what you see here, these are two scan copy at the moment here of the Colonial magazine. And on one side you have the Italian question, and on the other side you have written in Italian, and on the other side you have the African question. And the reason why we sort of like pair this, and that they sort of have been the opening image and the closing image, it's because these two questions are not separate. The problem of African migration nowadays is connected to the problem of Italian migration, and vice versa. The Italian colonization is connected to Africa, or East Africa being colonized. And that like all the questions that sort of occur in these two sides, they're like interdependent. And what I really appreciate about Dawit's work since the very beginning was that you always wanted to emphasize the ambiguity and the connection and the continuity. I remember this like word repeatedly in our conversation. The continuity of it, the continuous like recurrent of historical factors in different times, but in different places.
I come from a very small tribe that I was shocked to learn that Italian colonialism gave the Belen a certain amount of, there's a wonderful scholar from Italy called Vodalul Cirar who writes about how there were different dynamics that allowed certain groups that were not, that may have been historically persecuted to have a bit more agency. And it was such a profound sort of thing for me to think about, right? Is that is an incredibly complicated thing to entertain. It is not to mean to say that there is, it's not an argument for the virtues of colonialism, but it's to simply say that it's a very, very complex and nuanced and ambiguous sort of proposition. And so I'm happy that we were able to have conversations that were anchored around that. Yeah. Well, the study of history in that kind of an academic sort of route, as you know, as an immigrant and as a child of immigrants, was one of the few. You know, we all know the story. I don't have to repeat it. And so, but I went to school in a city called Saskatoon, and we had an amazing art department at Evan Hardy College, at Evan Hardy Collegiate, and so it was. I had access and support to develop my creativity, but it was simply nothing that I ever considered as a possibility for me until after university. And so I made images. I participated in what I would call various creative endeavors, but it's quite banal in terms of, there's the moment when I realize there is actually a place in this, in this for me, and that there's a viable way of doing it when I encountered a model traveling in Guatemala. And I thought, okay, so that there's a way in which I can do it. The trajectory then made sense for me to sort of think about. The challenge for me moving into the art world was directly located within the cultural and sort of personal questions. Sort of meaning the stories that were informing how I was growing and how I was living in the world on a day-to-day basis I wasn't seeing them reflected in the outside world. And so as soon as I moved into the study of art, it simply made sense for me to explore those narratives and those stories. And then the evolution was just a little bit further and further and further afield. And so primarily I began looking at my situatedness within the context of Canada. I then began to look at my situatedness within North America. And then the back and forth between Eritrea and here. And as with many immigrant communities, we have family all around the world. And so there was a significant portion of our mental space that was always committed to establishing a relationship between here and this elsewhere. So all of these questions, for me, simply made sense to articulate and to deal with within the context of art. And I think the best thing that I did was, and I'm grateful to my parents, was did a liberal arts education. So I hope, it's,
Are there any other questions from the public?
Exactly.
If not,
yeah. Thank you.
if not, I think thanks so much for your attention.